Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to our keynote lecture for the Critical Food Studies Network. I'll just introduce our speaker and then we can get straight to the seminar. Heather J. Sharkey is a professor in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of Pennsylvania. During the 2024 to 25 academic year, she is the Oliver Smithies Fellows at Balliol College of Oxford University. This year, she has also been a senior fellow in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, where she co-organized a winter school on commensality and cultural heritage in the Middle East and its diasporas. Her books include Living with Colonialism, Nationalism and Culture in the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, American Evangelicals in Egypt, Missionary Encounters in an Age of Empire, and a History of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle East. With Jeffrey Edward Green, she edited The Changing Terrain of Religious Freedom. She is currently writing a book about global microhistory in the Nile Valley. She regularly teaches a seminar at Penn on the history of food in the Middle East, and she also edits a book series for Edinburgh University Press on food and foodways in the Middle East, North Africa, and its diasporas. So we have such a talented guest with us today. And I personally met Heather 6 years ago in a class at Penn, where she taught me about public scholarship and Wikipedia. And since then, she's been an amazing mentor and friend. So I'm super honored to introduce you for our keynote lecture.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now, can everybody see me? Are they supposed to be able to see me in
Well, I can see you through from that
Got it.
camera.
Okay, great.
Thanks too.
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity, for inviting me to speak today. I'm really honored and excited, and regard this as an opportunity to present and test out and share some ideas. So I understand that the Critical Food Studies Network is new this year, and it's an exciting venture. Its website declares an aim to connect researchers across disciplines interested in the study, history, and consumption of food within both metaphorical and material contexts, and to bridge research and form interdisciplinary connections across fields at Oxford, including literature, history, anthropology, biology, and more. In my talk today, I propose to consider the contours of food studies in ways that can help us to think about what this network can do beyond hosting an intellectual smorgasbord or potluck of events. What goals and agendas can it aspire to have, and what impact can it make in leading scholarship that pertains broadly to food? So to address this question, I present my talk today as a thought experiment, an attempt to express a rationale for food studies while considering what it can offer. And I'll take as my springboard Vincent Van Gogh's 1885 oil painting, De Aardappeleters, known in English as the Potato Eaters, together with a few of his other potato-related works. This choice may seem surprising if you know that I'm a historian, though not an art historian, of the modern Middle East and North Africa, especially the modern Nile Valley, Egypt, and Sudan. In other words, I'm not a scholar who would ordinarily give a talk about Van Gogh. So in a few minutes, I'll explain how someone like me came to see a painting like the Potato Eaters as bearing on my research and on some of the big questions that confront us as we move through this field of food studies. So recently I was talking to a colleague about studying food through a network like this one. It's fun and interesting, she mused, plus I just like food. This reasoning is valid, and I agree with these sentiments, but I suggest that we can take this instinctive appreciation and articulate a collective purpose, a programmatic raison d'etre for this Critical Food Studies Network at Oxford. And maybe we could say something like this: food in all its forms and manifestations, including drink, is a very relatable subject. Food is elemental, even primordial. We depend on it for survival and often for enjoyment. We engage with it multiple times every day. We know food, we get it. Better yet, we can grasp it, both metaphorically in the sense of understanding it, and literally through touch or feel. We can smell it, taste it, see it, and even hear it, as when we crunch into an apple or slurp our soup. Food can offer experiential, multisensory, and embodied immediacy, which aids in apprehension and cognition. It can be abstract too, assuming symbolic meanings that we may intuit, or inhabiting our dreams and imaginations and leading to cravings, even if we might be hard pressed to put into words what we know, sense, or want. We can examine a food, let's say cheddar cheese, or a food-related subject or phenomenon, say the production of wheat or the manufacture of ceramic teacups, perhaps narrowing our topic down to a place or range of years, settling on, say, baklava in 20th century Istanbul. And we can start our examination at close range, at the micro level, and then zoom out to see issues of much larger significance. We can gather data from a wide range of sources: literary narratives, images, objects, statistical data, fieldwork observations, oral histories, and more to propel our analysis. We can then come to the same table to talk in ways that translate across training, methods, and interests. So to say that food studies is interdisciplinary, maybe to say that it offers a kind of intellectual commensality and congeniality. But for something that has so much collaborative interdisciplinary potential and so much multisensory force, it's surprising that it has taken so long to start a research collective like this one, which begs the question, why is this initiative so new? And why now? There have, of course, been important antecedents. Above all, the Oxford Food Symposium, which since 1979 has brought distinguished visitors in food writing to the city. The Oxford Food Symposium's website lists an awe-inspiring array of great cookbook writers, chefs, and scholars, rock stars of the food world like Claudia Roden, Harold McGee, and Elizabeth David, to mention just a few of my favorites from their roster. But my sense is that the Oxford Food Studies Symposium has been a forum for global gastronomy, the academic equivalent of haute cuisine, where restaurant entrepreneurs, best-selling authors, and world-class food influencers have converged. This research collective strikes me by contrast as an initiative centered on more mundane realities of lived food cultures, not necessarily food as it entails culinary experiences of the elites. I see parallels here with current anthropologically and sociologically centered interests in lived religion, religion as ordinary people do it, as opposed to religion as conveyed through theology, doctrine, and what religious leaders think people should be doing or believing. So perhaps we can say that this critical food studies network springs from an academic field in the making. So notice that I've called food studies a field in the making as opposed to a field already formed. To explain this choice, let me start with Wikipedia, a platform to which I regularly contribute and which has become one of my areas of scholarly interest. Wikipedia has an article on food studies, which currently says, and here I read from the first paragraph, food studies is the critical examination of food and its contexts within science, art, history, society, and other fields. It is distinctive from other food-related areas of study, such as nutrition, agriculture, gastronomy, and culinary arts, in that it tends to look beyond the consumption, production, and aesthetic appreciation of food, and tries to illuminate food as it relates to a vast number of academic fields. It is thus a field that involves and attracts philosophers, historians, scientists, literary scholars, sociologists, art historians, anthropologists, and others. Citation needed. The citation needed at the end of its lead paragraph is telling, especially considering that the Wikipedia article has been evolving since 2009, which I know because I checked its edit history. The citation needed tag reflects the fact that there are no obvious books to cite in defining what food studies is. And that is a sobering point. I also have to say disagree with the second sentence, which says that food studies tries to illuminate food. I would argue instead that the goal of the field is or should be to use food to illuminate other aspects of societies, environments, and human experiences within them, not to illuminate food itself. We are not studying baklava to see how it is made or how good it tastes. We could read a cookbook or a bakery review or watch a food video if that was what we wanted to know. In food studies, on the contrary, food is or should be the lens, vehicle, or medium for studying bigger questions and issues. We could use baklava, for example, to consider claims to Turkish as opposed to Greek national identity, or to understand the foodways, meaning the food customs of festive occasions, such as when or how people would serve it in what contexts, for example. So thinking about food studies as presented in this Wikipedia article, I've attempted to frame my own preliminary definition, which is a work in progress, and here it is. I would say that food studies is an interdisciplinary field of scholarship in the humanities and social sciences, which covers the production, preparation, consumption, exchange, environmental and social impact, symbolic import, and value of food for culture and health. Using diverse sources and analytical approaches, its practitioners treat food as a lens, vehicle, or medium to see and understand larger issues in societies and environments that are of relevance to human existence. So that's my preliminary definition. By the way, the picture you see there, those cookies, I made them from an Afghan cookbook, working with students to make things for class in conjunction with our with what we were doing, and also to use images and create Creative Commons licenses for them on Wikipedia. So incidentally, I see another sign of the field's lack of clarity in the fact that the journal called Food Studies, which was founded in 2011 and cornered the name, affirms that it is interdisciplinary, but sets out narrow parameters. The journal, as its website says, explores new possibilities for sustainable food production and human nutrition with a focus on policy, especially regarding responsible agriculture. There are a few other food-related journals out there. There's Food and History, published in France, Food and Foodways, which is more anthropological, and Gastronomica. Those come to mind, but they have different and also somewhat focused objectives. So what this all means is that there is no flagship journal to define or host the field in a way that is as spacious as this collective aims to be. So there's no journal for it yet either, really. So again, we have a field in the making. This means that our path may not be clear, but it also means that we're living in an exciting moment and can blaze new trails. So before leading us to Van Gogh, who I'm convinced had a love affair with potatoes, as many Dutch people seem to do, I propose now to tell you about how I became involved in food studies and about some of the compelling questions that it helps me to ask, and that will lead indeed to the potato. So some background is that I'm an avid cook and baker, and found myself reading, and maybe I should use a food metaphor and say devouring food-related articles in the newspapers over many years. And some of these related to food-related policies and economics, like why is the price of eggs so high, to businesses, which I find fascinating, such as the changing layout of Starbucks outlets, reflecting efforts to appeal to or steer customers, and matters of health, such as, why are chickpeas and how are chickpeas good for you? So one day, several years ago, I had a sudden flash of inspiration. I thought, why not teach a class on the subject? Because I enjoy reading and thinking about it so much. And also because I realized such a class would be very possible in Middle Eastern studies, because there is an impressive, if diffuse, academic literature on food-related topics from the Islamic Middle East, as well as a vast body of Arabic cookbooks, some of them translated going back 1,000 years. And here are three classics that I realized would be great. Sami Zubaydah and Richard Tapper's Culinary Cultures of the Middle East, Ralph Haddock's Coffee and Coffee Houses, I forget the subtitle, the Ottoman Near East, something in the Near East, and then Lilia Zawali's medieval cuisine of the Islamic world. So these are just three that were obvious. Then too, the Near East was critical to the development of agriculture, as archaeologists attest, while the growth of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in the region means that there's a lot to say about food from the perspective of religious texts and practices too. So it was obvious it was going to be very doable to do a class of this time. And I knew it could be both, at the same time, rigorous, possible, and fun. So I developed an undergraduate seminar at the University of Pennsylvania called Food in the Islamic Middle East. And I've offered it every year since then. Students have loved it, and over the years have written excellent research papers on original topics, and several have gone on to publish in undergraduate journals and in a couple of cases, professional journals. So to give you one example, a student named Ella Poole, who is in the School of Nursing at Penn, and she's actually an amateur beekeeper. And so when it came time to do the paper, I said, why not do something on honey production? She wrote this incredible paper about beekeeping practices in Saudi Arabia today, and the sort of the cultural value of honey, but also the environmental challenges and debates about bees and beekeeping in the country. And the journal that we found is actually published at the University of Nebraska, and it's Review of Undergraduate Research in Agricultural and Life Sciences. And I just downloaded this screenshot, or did the screenshot yesterday, and you can see her article has been downloaded 930 times in the last 4 years. So 3.5 years. So it's really had an impact. And I think that just goes to show how also new, how much room there is for people to be exploring new topics. So 2 summers ago, these interests led me to spend a month on a fellowship at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., investigating their Middle Eastern cookbook collections. And these interests also inspired me to propose a new book series at Edinburgh University Press on food and foodways in the Middle East, North Africa, and its diasporas. And I just remembered, do not let me forget, I have cards for this series. They're in my bag. So I should put them out on the table so that I don't forget to give them to you all. And you can spread the word, even if you might not be able to find it. It's in here somewhere. Don't let me forget that I want to give them to you. By the way, that bread there, I made it. It's a 13th century challah recipe from Helene Jahara Pinier's cookbook, and she was one of your speakers. She calls for lavender blossoms. I used rose petals, and I think I like the look of the rose. So anyway, these interests also led me this January, as Maria mentioned, to organize a winter school with my colleague Karen Summerer Sanchez at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands on commensality and cultural heritage in the Middle East and its diasporas, which we will be offering again in January 2026, so please consider applying. And it's that venture at Groningen that took me to Van Gogh and his potatoes. That picture, by the way, is also of a medieval recipe from Nawal Nasrallah, who it's from a 13th century cookbook, a 13th century hummus recipe, basically, which has a lot of herbs in it, which is why it's more green in color. Okay, so let me start with a disclaimer. I am not a world expert on potatoes, although I enjoy eating them. For most of my life, I took potatoes for granted, as I assume most of you have as well. And why should we think too much about them? Looking back, though, I realized that I've been curious about some aspects of potatoes for a long time. My parents left me with a vague sense that we owed one side of our family's immigration to the United States, if not to the Irish potato famine directly, then to its consequences and the generation that followed. I have long been intrigued by the fact that the potato was a New World crop from Peru and Bolivia, and then it spread to the Old World. But I've had a hard time imagining a place like England without potatoes. It's hard to imagine, what were the English eating before potatoes? In Balliol College, where I'm based this year, there are potatoes every day at lunch in some form. It's a different form every day. And it's as much of a staple as bread. And it's like I'm trying to imagine South Asia without chili peppers, another New World import, which is why we have chili pepper themed potato chips on the table for everybody to try afterwards. Then, too, as someone who's been an inveterate reader of labels since childhood, I've always found labels on food items interesting. I was always curious that the potatoes in the supermarkets in my hometown in New Jersey came from two states that otherwise drew a blank in my mind: Idaho out west and Maine to the northeast, wedged between the Canadian provinces of Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. So I was always wondering, why were these two such far apart states growing so many potatoes that ended up in our supermarkets? These interests remained relatively latent until, while planning a trip to Antwerp in Belgium many years ago, I saw in a travel guide that one of the city's museums, the Planten Moretus Museum, which is dedicated to the history of printing, had the earliest known drawing of a potato in Europe from 1589. So I dragged my husband along to see it, even before we went to the city's Beaux-Arts Museum to see the paintings by Rubens. I assumed that potato eating took off from there, that it was an immediate hit upon landing in Europe, that it went straight to the culinary canon. Wrong. It's true that leading European botanists started to grow potato plants from early on, but how the potato wended its way into diets is somewhat harder to trace. From a marvelous book called Potatoes, A Short History by Andrew F. Smith, which I've assigned to students over the years, I've learned a lot. From Smith, I learned that potatoes didn't really take off as a staple food in Western Europe until the 1700s, following a famine. I learned that poor people ate it, but also pigs on farms. Rich people were more standoffish, at least in France, where potatoes were banned in 1748 because of the belief that they caused leprosy, because they looked like leprosy. That was, I think, the idea. That was the thinking. So enter Antoine Augustin Parmentier, who ate potatoes as a French prisoner in Hanover, Germany after the 7 Years' War, and who came to enjoy them and believe in their nutritional value. Parmentier confided to his friend, the polymath Benjamin Franklin, who founded the University of Pennsylvania, who was famously practical. And Franklin persuaded Parmentier in 1778 to hold a dinner party, which you may have heard about because it's a famous dinner party, with all the courses, including the dessert, made from potatoes, so that he could show his powerful friends, who included the chemist Antoine Lavoisier, how delicious and healthy potatoes could be. The rest was history. The dinner party catapulted potatoes into the ranks of French haute cuisine, paving the way for dishes like potatoes Anna, a mid-19th century creation which the great food writers Simone Beck and Julia Child hailed as the supreme potato dish of all time. Around this time, potatoes also displaced bread as an ingredient in one of my own favorite French dishes, aligot, from South Central France, which is a gloppy and gluey but addictive cheese and potato concoction. How many people have tried it here? Oh, I mean, I think it's great. For Americans, it's like a cross between Elmer's glue and Play-Doh, texture-wise, or like oobleck, if any of you remember that. But it's really addictive. So these insights, thinking about the potato, led me to some simple but striking realizations about food history. What we may think is traditional isn't. Traditions, so-called, are often quite new, and food practices may change by stealth. Foods can wend their ways into daily lives until they come to seem so natural that everyone takes them for granted. By the way, they can disappear just as quietly. And if you ask me afterwards, I can give you a few examples, but actually here are two. These breads, these are my breads that I made, they're made from emmer and einkorn wheat, which are early wheats, very rarely grown. I think there are only 2 or 3 farms in the United States that grow them, ancient early forms of wheat. And it's very, very hard to find that. The potato, by contrast, is such an elusive but important actor in history that the great historian William McNeill, credited for his role in shaping the fields of world history, environmental history, and the history of disease as we know them today, published an early career article in 1949 on the history of the potato in Ireland. And 50 years later, in 1999, a more ambitious article called How the Potato Changed the World's History. So this January, I was in the northern reaches of the Netherlands to run the winter school that I mentioned at the University of Groningen on the food-centered theme of commensality and cultural heritage in the Middle East and its diasporas. Talking to a local resident one day, the subject of Groningen restaurants came up, along with the subject of foreign restaurants, including those run by Syrian refugees who had arrived about 10 years ago in the wake of the Syrian civil war. This resident was praising the delicious food that these Syrian places were serving, but contrasted it with traditional Dutch food, such as French fries and oliebollen, which literally translate to mean oil balls. And there are these wads of dough that are just fried, which, yeah, they're not my favorite, but they're really into it in Groningen. Now, the Dutch take their French fries very seriously. You can go into a really fancy restaurant and order French fries in any serious restaurant. And indeed, I noted that the busiest eatery in town seemed to be one particular frietwinkel, which drew customers of all ages and backgrounds. Drawing upon my knowledge of potato history, it struck me that French fries could not be that old. It was a traditional food that was probably only 2 centuries old, much younger than the golden age of Dutch trade or of old masters art by painters like Rembrandt and Vermeer, which are so important to the Dutch sense of heritage too. Something from my graduate training also in African history also rang a bell about when cheap cooking oil became accessible to Europeans through trade, enabling the frying of potatoes or donuts on a large scale. I need to look it up, but I think it's 19th century too. So the palm oil trade from what's now Ghana, the Gold Coast, and areas like that, it's quite late. And in the Middle East, I think corn oil only started entering in to a large degree by the 1930s. So these are late developments. Back in Groningen and near this popular French fry shop, which as I realized drew crowds for a good reason, because they fry, there's my portion. They fry each portion to order. You have to wait. You place the order for your portion of fries, and then you wait for it. And so it's really fresh. Near there is the Groningen Art Museum, which was holding a special exhibit on Van Gogh when I was in town. The museum tied this exhibit to 2 events. First, the relatively recent return of their only Van Gogh painting, which was stolen at the start of the COVID pandemic and mysteriously returned, dumped on their doorstep in a big blue IKEA bag 2 years ago. A bag which is also now in a case as part of the exhibit. And and the 2 things about this, first of all, it's really not a very good Van Gogh. I'm sorry. If you saw it, you'd be like, no, there's no way that's a Van Gogh. It was an early Van Gogh. The other thing is that the IKEA bag, it looks kind of glamorous in this picture, but the bag, if you've ever been to an IKEA, it's those, those big plastic bags near the entryway, which are near the carts. It's one of those. So somebody took it out of the frame and, put it in and the label, it's cool. They've got the label of the Swedish designers who designed the bag. So they're treating the bag as an object of art and design. So it's actually a really clever exhibit. So that's one thing. But the second thing that was going on in Groningen was a commemoration of an art show that a group of Groningen graduate students, people like you guys, organized in 1896, 6 years after Van Gogh's death, with support from the widow of Van Gogh's beloved brother Theo. And the grad students she agreed to send them all the work she could get at a time when he really wasn't widely known. And so they had this special exhibit on Van Gogh and Groningen about this graduate student initiative, which really helped to spread the word and establish his reputation. Among the works in this current exhibit is a still life on loan from a museum in Rotterdam, a glistening gold-toned painting of potatoes, as well as a pencil drawing of a field of potatoes, which I'll show you later. My daughter, who was visiting me around this time, saw the exhibit and alerted me to the potato painting. And then she told me something else that intrigued me. She said that she saw elsewhere in town a historic photograph from the late 19th century, 1890s or so, of the nearby and still active fish market with women. The picture was showing women selling potatoes from a cart. That same day, wandering in that same fish market, which is next to the main market square, and it includes many fruit and vegetable sellers, she told me that she saw an entire awning-covered stand which sells only potatoes, about 20 varieties in all, in different colors, shapes, and sizes, each labeled by name and with a description of its properties: waxy, floury, slightly sweet, good for baking, good for frying, etc. There's a riot of potatoes. So again, I found myself reflecting on the new immigrant Syrian restaurants, as well as the Vietnamese restaurants in town, and relative to the French fry shop, which was serving a delicacy that was not as traditional as the local Groningers imagined. And I found myself reflecting on Van Gogh's still life, which seemed to treat potatoes in the way he treated irises, sunflowers, and cherry blossoms, which is to say, with attention and affection as objects of everyday beauty. And I should add, upon examining this photograph of the potato stand more closely, I realized, and you can see over my head, the names of the potatoes. The potatoes are named, a lot of them have girls' names. There's a potato called Irene or Irene, and there's a Nicola, and there are other female names. It's very like a love. They take their potatoes really seriously. They have names and they treat them kind of lovingly, is the way that I would describe it. So thinking about this, and remembering, I searched online for a painting that I had studied in art history class when I was in high school, and it came to mind, The Potato Eaters. Famous painting, right? With its dim drab and colors and misshapen faces from, again, Van Gogh's early period when he was just getting started. This canvas is not one of my favorites, although we know from the letters that he left, that especially to his brother, that Van Gogh himself thought that it was a great work that would make his career. I was struck as I browsed online by how many American commentators seem to describe the Potato Eaters as a lamentation for the downtrodden state of Dutch farmers in an age of industrialization. I saw that again and again on blogs written by Americans who seem to be living in New York City. And I'm thinking, no, I disagree with this assessment for a couple of reasons. One was that I realized that the Dutch name of the painting includes the Dutch word aardappel, which carries a different, and I would argue, more august symbolic weight than the English word potato, which calls to mind phrases like couched potato, suggesting laziness. So to the extent that potato has symbolic weight in English, I don't think it's a positive weight. Whereas the Dutch word, which is close to the German word, it has a much more serious symbolic weight. Think about the implications of calling something an earth apple versus a potato, or earth apple eaters versus potato eaters. I'm not a Bible expert by any means, but the name in Dutch strikes me as very primordial and scriptural, recalling the story of Adam and Eve, think of earth and the apple. And while at the same time, the scene on the canvas recalls a verse from the book of Matthew: "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Instead of lamenting the plight of farmers, I wondered, could Van Gogh have been honoring them for their quiet humility and simple nobility, and for their family spirit? I became convinced that he was, especially after learning that Van Gogh had been a preacher before he decided to go into art. This is a still life of his father's Bible. There's surely a lesson in here about language, meaning, and the limits of translation, as well as about the symbolic dimensions of food. And I think it's also telling that when I shared my theories with Dutch colleagues, they all said, yeah, absolutely. potato eater, earth apple eaters has completely different connotations. And of course, Van Gogh was steeped in this biblical learning and lore and ideas. And so they seem to think it was obvious. So I think when we see like food, blogs or commentaries or museum commentaries in English, they have a very different set of assumptions as they approach his art. Meanwhile, there was another aspect of the painting that struck me, which commentators only noted in passing, that the farmers in the painting were not only eating potatoes, they were also drinking coffee. The painting, I realized, was a historical document, showing not only the naturalization of New World potatoes into Dutch farmers' diets, but also the global exchange and naturalization of coffee, which would have come from or passed through the Middle East and its trade routes via the Isthmus of Suez, or after 1869, 16 years before Van Gogh did the painting, through the Suez Canal, because that's when it opened to traffic. So recall the history of coffee. Scholars think that it originated in Ethiopia and went to Yemen, where it became popular among Sufis who liked how it kept them awake as they stayed up reciting their prayers. From there, it spread to cities like Mecca, Cairo, and Istanbul, before venturing to Paris and London, or rather, to Oxford. And indeed, Balliol College is proud to count among its alumni Nicholas Canopius from the Ottoman island of Crete, who studied at the university from 1637 to 1648, and who was reportedly the first person to brew coffee in England, as opposed to the first person to open a coffee house in England, which happened a few years later. And I gather that there's a dispute over that between these two coffee houses on High Street, who claim the designation and say it's around 1650. But the brewing of coffee started earlier, and it started right here. The bottom line is that coffee became sufficiently cheap, common, and accessible that it entered farmers' diets, giving them the kind of jolt that the great Oxford-born historian E.P. Thompson later ascribed to sugar as used in tea in his classic 1963 book on the making of the English working class. The fact that a coffee pot appears in the Potato Eaters shows how pervasive coffee had become in the Dutch countryside. So while I'm on the subject, and before I start to wrap up, I have a few more things to say about Van Gogh and his potatoes. Until recently, many scholars assumed that he painted this tuber only in his Dutch period, before he ventured to the warmer, drier, and sunnier environment of France, which is where, again, he painted his irises, sunflowers, and haystacks in all their vivid glory. But a new study from the last few years, very, very new, has established that Van Gogh painted his gold-toned potato still life, the one I saw in Groningen, during his French period. Notably, Alexandra van Dongen of the Boijmans van Beuningen Museum in Rotterdam, which owns the painting and had loaned it to Groningen, studied the clay pot in the painting and identified it as coming from Valoris in southeast France, a town that later became associated with Picasso, who ended up reviving the ceramics art movement in this town. So not only ceramics for industrial production, but also ceramics as art. So, in other words, by drawing on evidence internal to the painting, Van Dongen was able to reassess its date and location to Paris in 1886 or 1887. That is 1 to 2 years after the Potato Eaters, and around the time that Van Gogh met Gauguin and some of the other painters who entered his circle. I tell you this because it offers a lesson about scholarly method, how one can extract clues, in this case from pictorial evidence, while looking at something familiar in a new way. I mean, people have been looking at this painting now for 140 years, and it's taken this time to say, no, actually, he didn't stop painting potatoes when he left the Netherlands. His fascination for this vegetable remained. The still life from Rotterdam, in fact, was not Van Gogh's last liaison with the potato. In 1889, in the final year of his life in Havre, he painted another bowl of potatoes, this one in even sunnier yellows and blues, which I think we can see clearly reflects the influence of Cézanne, with whose work he was familiar. I think especially that sort of grid pattern that you see on the top is, I think, what really does that. So I will conclude by sharing a few takeaways, to use a word that in its British but not American sense can refer to carry-out food. It's only a British usage where it means that, but it's good for our purposes. So first, food studies enjoins us to think critically and with nuance about what is new and what is old, what has continued and what has changed, points that strike at the heart of what historians do. As with the potato, the subjects of this field prompt us to question tradition, and I would also suggest authenticity, which tends to be just as misleading or mythical, especially when mixed in with food. Drives me crazy to hear people talking about authentic food. I'm not sure that exists. Thinking about food traditions, it strikes me that during my own lifetime on the East Coast of the United States, I saw avocados, to give one example, go from being a rare, expensive oddity in my childhood to a fixture on coffee tables in the form of guacamole for the annual celebration of Super Bowl Sunday. So for many Americans, guacamole has become a Super Bowl tradition, with grocery stores even stacking pyramids of avocados in the week leading up to it. Second, as an interdisciplinary undertaking, food studies encourages us to take what we've got, to use sources creatively while crossing fields to get to where we want to go. It keeps us on our toes. It has the potential to be multisensory and to draw on unlikely sources down to objects like pots and pans, such as the copper pot that one can still buy just to make potatoes Anna. It lends itself to the study of the tangible and the symbolic, the material and the theoretical, the everyday and the special occasion. Third, food studies is congenial. Its relatability means that we can gather at the same table to share what we've got and to think through topics, methods, or conclusions. The pursuit of scholarship can be very lonely, but food studies is a really companionable field, with companion being yet another food-laden term, evoking a person with whom one shares bread, because its Latin roots come from the words meaning with and bread. In short, think of how many insights we can extract from just Van Gogh's potato eaters. Insights about changing patterns of globalization, trade and agriculture, health and diet, art and cuisine, and more. We can see in his canvas abstract cultural values too, bearing on matters of religion, labor, class, and kinship. Ultimately, we can investigate myriad aspects of human existence by following the social lives of one painting and of a thing as humble as a bowl of potatoes. At a time when the field of food studies is still taking shape, the possibilities it presents and the opportunities that it offers are truly exciting. So thank you. I forget, everybody should take some potatoes, and they're the chili kind there, and I've got these cards. I'm gonna pass around the box, and if you'd like one of the cards, or if you know somebody who might be interested, or I'll pass, yeah, these are the cards for the book series at Edinburgh. So I'll just take some of these out, pass them around. These, there we go.
Thank you so much, Heather, for a really fascinating talk. I'm just gonna over to this side to moderate the questions. So we do have some time for a Q&A, and Heather has very kindly agreed to answer questions. So for the people in the chat, if you have anything, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'm happy to read them out loud. For anyone here in person, if you have any questions, feel free to stick a hand up and just get to it. Yep, so we'll start with you and then you.
Thank you so much. That was really enjoyable. I'm Danish, and I would say the Danes arguably love the potatoes as much as the Dutch have. So I was just really curious if you looked into Danish potato culture. And I also wanted to mention that the Emma and einkorn has been revived in Denmark recently. So it's quite common now.
Oh,
It's common, traditionally. But
yeah.
so it's quite.
Are you able to find it easier? Because
Yeah.
I bought einkorn flour in Yahoo, which is a Whole Foods shop at the beginning of the Cowley Road.
Yeah. And there's
Oh.
also Shilton Mill also sells it. Yeah, I bought this one in
that's
the UK.
great.
I think Switzerland too, you can get it. There's been this whole revival of these ancient grains in several European countries.
That's wonderful. I mean, I'm glad to see it. As of a few years ago, there was a farm in Pennsylvania, one in South Carolina, and then there aren't that many places growing it. But at the same time that we're seeing this expansion, I'm also seeing a retraction. For example, of mainstream grocery stores eliminating rye flour, for example. So it actually becomes harder, and you have to go to specialist shops and whatnot.
Yeah.
So it's great to see the revival, and I think we're going to be seeing more the revival of things like sorghum and millet and barley. Barley is an example of something that has disappeared from Middle Eastern cookbooks, even though that's the place where barley came from. If you look at the only Middle Eastern cookbooks that I know that have barley recipes are the ones that include Armenian and Kurdish food. And otherwise, you don't see it. Like Claudia Rodin, for example, does not have any barley recipes as far as I recall. So that's just an example. I have not looked at the Danish love affair with the potato. But I will. I mean, obviously, I'm at the beginning of this potato journey, and there's so much to learn. But what is really funny is if you see how loving people are, and that's the word, is affectionate, and you see Van Gogh's other works, it really changes the understanding of something like the potato eaters, and you realize how much people appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed that. I was wondering about practice, which is a fancy name in this context for, cooking, and the role of doing that as a part of food studies. Because you made a point at the beginning about, there's a lot of kind of boundary drawing, kind of somewhat paradoxically for a subject that also wants to be interdisciplinary, but I think that's reasonable.
Yeah.
But to distinguish, for example, from gastronomy or the culinary arts. But it also strikes me that a lot of people who are interested in food studies are also interested in cooking, and that cooking is potentially a research tool, could be seen as a research tool for recreating, another way to access the past, for example. I'm a historian of science, and this isn't a big part of our field, but in some people, recreate experiments as a way to better understand what was happening.
I
just wonder if
agree.
you've thought at all about
I
that.
have,
Clearly,
yes.
cook a lot and do that with your students.
No, absolutely, I have. It's just that I think the term gastronomy and culinary arts often has a more elite connotation, and there's the phrase gastro-nationalism. It suggests a kind of food power, food diplomacy. So I guess my interests are in that as well, and in the culinary arts, but also on more grassroots experiences, including food scarcity, for example. Now, I'm a complete believer in this idea of experiential learning, and has tremendous scholarly and pedagogical applications. I've started to incorporate it into all of my classes for a couple of reasons. One is that there's this idea of recreating a recipe. I've been making historic recipe recreations with students, but I think it's also for all of us, the tangibility, the physicality, the embodiedness of creating, of smelling, of using more than just our eyes for reading or our ears for hearing, but engaging with the subject from many different sensory points of view and moving while doing it makes the learning process more vivid. I also, that's from the point of view of learning. But then also from the point of view of scholarship, I think in other fields, and this is how food studies can learn, and maybe historians in general and anthropologists can learn too, and people from different areas. But I know, for example, archaeologists are starting to do more of what they call, what is it? They have a phrase for it. Is it like, it's like, I think what you said, like it be experiential, they're recreating things. I know somebody who's actually taking ceramics lessons so that he can try to recreate Byzantine ceramics and understand the processes and understand the technological difficulties of creating different glazes and so forth. And I know people have done that with regard to weaving as well, of trying to recreate. It has not entered much history though. I mean, I think it's still rare to find that experiential aspect in the discipline of history, but I think it's really valuable.
I think one of the reasons might be because it's very hard to cite that, right? Like it's a discipline that's so much based on textual citation. I mean, including paintings and stuff. It sort of creates a challenge for how do we incorporate that into scholarly practice. I mean, I think it's an interesting and worthy challenge, but I think it.
Yeah, I did that as on an experimental level with creating having students engage with one particular cookbook. We tried to create a public facing humanities ebook platform that also included some video elements, which were the students recreating recipes and so forth. And so we did try that, but it is also really difficult for other reasons as well. There are the privacy issues, and there are also finding platforms to host that kind of scholarship. That's actually a big one. Where do you host it? How do you publish it?
Yeah, what's the basis for the claims that you make?
Yeah.
Like a lot of the knowledge of cooking in the past, I know this is based on knowledge that was never written down, right? That was passed orally or just by practice. And so
Yeah.
it makes it even harder. So as you know, the research that's done in the present has a different sort of evidential relationship to the
Right.
past than work that's done based on textual.
Yeah.
And more conventional sources.
And then there are the things that are difficult to recreate. Like I was talking about things that disappeared in early Islamic cookbooks. There's this condiment called murri, which seems to have been made from fermented barley. And it sounds like it was kind of like a soy sauce, basically. But nobody really knows, and it's completely disappeared. Why did it disappear? Partly it seems that when the tomato came in, that kind of sour umami quality took over, and now people can only guess. But it's also dangerous. Do you really want to get your students involved in rotting barley, which is what you'd have to do if you did that? Or do you want to be the guinea pig for your own experiments? That's another thing to worry about.
But that's a great example of like how the past is sort of like inaccessible in
Yeah.
some fundamental way.
Absolutely.
So we've got a couple of questions back there and a couple of comments from Dimitri in the chat that I think have related to the conversations just happening. So Dimitri says, I've been studying buckwheat and buckwheat kasha. Another example of going out of style in the US for general public. Buckwheat is a word of Dutch origin, another point of connection. And then I think in relation to the conversation that was just taking place now about some of the difficulties of experiential, like kind of styles of methodology, we are adding color to the Parthenon and Greek Roman marbles, a nice parallel to adding color back as another dimension to visual authenticity and expression. So in terms of questions, I think you in the back had your hand raised first, and then you.
Thanks so much, Heather. This was really, really fascinating. I love potatoes, and it was really, really interesting. I have so many questions, but I'm running off to pursue a food-related activity, which is breaking my fast because it's Ramadan. But yes, thank you. This was really, really fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a little potato anecdote for you, Heather. My grandmother grew up in Rustic County in a potato farming family. So she grew up, they would have like a 2-week break from school just to pick potatoes, that kind of thing. But my grandmother would never willingly eat an Idaho potato. So I'm just saying that as a, it really raised very strong emotions. This is like Idaho potatoes are not real potatoes. They have to come from Maine.
Well, it's funny because I was looking online and apparently a century ago, Maine was the largest producer of US potatoes. And now it's been far outstripped. Far outstripped. And it's not just Idaho. Idaho's number one, but there are other states. I'm forgetting which ones. Maybe it's Michigan. I'm forgetting which states it was. I was surprised. But I had the opportunity to go to Idaho for a conference a few years ago, 2 years ago, and I loved it. It was fascinating. But one of the fascinating things was how seriously they take their potatoes. And they have French fry restaurants. And similarly to what you see in Groningen, you can choose your kind of potato there. It's not just like one potato. It's just you choose your potato. And they take it, and the potato board is located in next pretty much like 2 blocks away from the Capitol building, state Capitol building. It's in prime real estate. So they really take it close, seriously, and it is a key part of the identity. And it's interesting to think, the emotive force that a crop like that can have.
Yeah, and in general, and I was just going to mention to you as well, you may already know this, but there's a book that I read the manuscript on the history of the tomato in Egypt that's going to come out soon.
Annie Gall.
And one of the fascinating things about it is that she talks about how, Egyptians think, the tomato, it's like part of our traditional cuisine. And as somebody myself who spent years in Egypt, I can't imagine not having tomatoes there, right? But in fact, she shows how it's relatively recent.
It's extremely recent. Even though it was known in the Ottoman Empire for, since I think the 17th century,
but
didn't really use it, and they ate it in its green, unripened form,
right.
And they would cook it. And so it's fascinating to think. I do an exercise with my students sometimes where I give them 5 minutes and tell them I assign each person a Middle Eastern country and have them find one potato recipe online. And it's really interesting to see the diffusion of the potato throughout the Middle East. It has been uneven. And in the Gulf states, for example, it's only there in the form of French fries, and it has not been indigenized the way it might have been in, say, Syria.
Yeah.
So it's really striking the unevenness of that process.
So I think we had a question all the way at the back.
I think I was quite excited by good action from being Mario that my question has to be something kind of cultural and political. So potato was brought to India by the British. And while reading the economic history of the world from 1000 onwards, I realized how, this where your thing comes in, that how food can be an entry point to understand how imperial powers, the history of imperialism, because initially this is what they wanted. Maize was introduced, nutmeg was introduced, potato was introduced to India. And then if we do for sugarcane, then we understand how slavery came in, and how sweet came in, and how diabetes came into it. So these studies, food, if we, take it as an entry point to go ahead and do not just the cultural habits and the practices and what people are delighted to eat or not, or they don't know where it's coming from. It has a whole history of how plantations were done. Wherever we can plant, make more money from which soil, and this is how they started growing in each.
Yeah, and so 2 thoughts on that. One is, it's really, if you were to go and Google which country, I would urge you all to do this because it's fascinating. Which country is the biggest potato producer and consumer in the world? Do you know what it is?
Russia.
I think it's China.
China.
And that's a real surprise because, growing up, again, thinking about my childhood in New Jersey, I do not recall ever seeing any potato dishes in Chinese restaurants. When I speak to my Chinese students, I started to ask them about that. I say, do you guys eat potatoes in your meal? Oh, yeah, all the time. And this is an example of this stealth ingredient where it's been incorporated. But I think because of the waves of immigration into the United States and the establishment of Chinese restaurant culture in the United States, we don't see potatoes so much in Chinese restaurants in the United States for that reason. But it's clearly been expanding, and the same in India. And I think in the Smith book, he mentions what's striking, and Pakistan as well, but what's striking about it is that in the case of India, many of the potatoes may be grown in the north, but they're actually really popular in the south, more popular, he suggests, especially among vegetarians who like the, it's filling and so on and so forth. So there's that unevenness. But when you mentioned this point about food and imperialism, another example that comes to mind are debates that scholars are starting to write about wheat policies in the 20th century and the promotion of particularly Mexican varieties of wheat all over the world through UN agencies and the World Health Organization and so forth, and the displacement of the other grains that we were talking about, or the displacement of sorghum and other crops. The problem now being that those varieties of wheat, which had very high yields, relied on a lot of water. And so one of the reasons for the revival of interest in these other crops now is the environmental concerns about what will be sustainable. And that's also, so the health and the environmental, but then food policies that encouraged or discouraged the promotion of different crops at different times.
Which caused the Bengal famine to rise the rate that wanted to the cash crops versus the regular food crops, and the Bengal famine is the reason for that. Actually.
Yes.
That was an imperial policy.
Right. And there have been studies, for example, about Sudan too, about the promotion of wheat over sorghum as well. And the manipulation and the consequences and the effect on famine and so forth.
So I think Mario had a question. There are a couple in the chat that I want to get to, and then back there.
Thank you, Heather. I really liked your definition about food studies, especially since it's so new and dispersed. And it reminded me of a lot of the literature I read on film and media studies and anthropology. It's sort of how like film and TV is only important when it's rendered useful in our everyday lives, and like how it reveals stuff about our inner thoughts and culture. So I was just wondering if you thought sort of anthropology offers something new to any interdisciplinary initiative that sort of other fields can't, because it reminded me of this other definition.
That's a good question. I mean, I think two thoughts. Three, okay, if I can keep them straight in my mind. One is, I think anthropology is the glue for any kind of interdisciplinary undertaking. I could be biased. I'm a historian. I have my PhD in history, my undergraduate degree in anthropology. The anthropologist's willingness to look for meaning in small details of everyday life, I think, is absolutely critical to any kind of undertaking. So I think, honestly, I think anthropology is the anchor. At the same time, I've heard skeptics say, and it reminds me of your comment about cinema and media studies, whose name is also changing, by the way, because you used to see cinema studies programs, and now you'll see cinema and media studies programs. And so why is the name changing? Somebody that I know says, anytime you see the word studies attached to a field, it means it's not really a field. I'm not saying that I totally agree with it. I'm trying to come up with a response. I'm trying to come up with a response to that one, but it kind of, I kind of see where that's coming from, right? Yeah. So what is film and media studies? Why? And then your third the third thing that comes to mind in response to what you said is, it only gets invoked when it seems relevant, or how did you say it seems relevant to life? Or you said something like,
oh, like in human life rather than food itself being.
Okay. So a thought in response to that. One thing I didn't put in because there wasn't time, but it's this question about the stigma of studying food. So it's not been a field or a subject that people have taken very seriously. People have considered it, or sometimes I think maybe cinema and media studies might have that as well. It's sort of considered more popular. It's not as weighty, is the perception. I mean, I told you I went to the Library of Congress. I should say their cookbook collection is not that great because they didn't really collect that much. They've missed a lot. A place that has a really good cookbook collection is the University of Pennsylvania. For a variety of reasons, some historically accidental, where they ended up collecting cookbook collections, or including a colonial American cookbook collection. They took it seriously. And they ended up getting gifts and accepting the gifts. So their collection is, I think, pretty serious. But it's a problem that certain subjects have slight stigmas and have to justify their existence. I think that's starting to change with regard to food studies. I think there was a gender dimension as well. I think that's why there wasn't so much collection of cookbooks. But it's starting to change because its importance is undeniable and touching upon so many important aspects of human existence, including health and the environment. And we just can't ignore it anymore. For the sake of human societies, we need to bring it all together. And I would also say that now one thing that's also happening is archaeology. We might think, oh, that's very far removed from the people studying, health issues now, coming out of medicine, say. Well, no, because it turns out that, for example, with environmental strains and health issues, now there's a revival of interest in the ancient grains, and of that, other foods that people were eating, other patterns of living that people followed in the past. So the evidence that archaeologists might have about human diets in the past, or even looking at dental evidence, some of them, using all kinds of evidence, are going to have and are starting to have bearings on topics that are of immediate relevance to our lives today.
A really interesting question from Victor in the chat, and I think this is in relation to the pictures you took at the fish market. So he says, funny that potatoes have mostly female names. Any idea why that is? Also, comparing food and religion is very interesting. Do you sometimes work on the role food plays in religious rituals and vice versa? There are also potato gods and goddesses in some religions, mostly in Latin America.
That's great. I only noticed that point about the names of the potatoes today when I was looking at the picture again in preparation for today, and I suddenly saw, wait, there's a side. Who's Irene? I was like, who's Rosa? And I suddenly realized that there are the female names of the potatoes, and then I Googled it, and I looked up, and you could Google this, try this, potato Irene, but you have to do it in Dutch. Aardappel, Irene. Just do aardappel, Irene, or aardappel, this, that, and the other, and it will pull up the potato, this beautiful rose-colored potato, and so forth. So I'm still thinking through that, but I think it's an affectionate term, and it's similar, probably. I guess botanists would have ideas about the naming of roses or the naming of daffodils. There's a similar pattern. You don't find as many named after men, for example. So that's just a thought there. And the second one, food and religion is a huge topic. That's also why I realized I could teach this class. There are the issues of evocations of and it's even more subtle than you would think, as scholars are beginning to realize. People might think, oh, you could study halal, that's one angle, or kosher practices, like dietary laws and policies, that's one thing. But you could also study issues of holiday observation, the calendrical commemoration. I went to a fascinating conference during COVID, it was online, about one particular kind of pudding made in Turkey and Armenia and Iran and Syria, which has all kinds of symbolic weight among Muslims, Christians, Jews, members of other religious communities, served for births, funerals, as diplomatic gifts, and so on. There's so much to say. So it's an incredible, and not just religion, gender dynamics, class dynamics. There's so much to say.
Absolutely.
It's once you start studying food, you realize, as you know, I don't have to tell you, you know this, you're writing your dissertation on it. But there are just so many possibilities that it opens up.
Absolutely. I think you had a question.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I kind of wanted to go back to the point about cooking as sort of a research practice and method. I wanted to expand upon that, on gathering your thoughts on taste and sort of experiencing taste as almost like an affective response, as like a way of, as like a form of data collection, and if that you would consider that a type of data that you think we should be seeing more in research. And yeah, just the I know it's subjective, but sort of if you think that would be widely, or at least in certain spaces, critical spaces, like if that would be an accepted thing to study.
I do that, but I have a question for you. Are you thinking about taste? Because in English, we mean two things by taste often. We mean like taste as in flavor or sensory perception. And then there's often the use of taste as meaning like, what's good quality? Do you have taste? Do you show taste? And I sometimes hear people use those terms without being conscious of which meaning they mean. So which one are you thinking of?
Preferably the former. I'm also doing my dissertation on food related stuff, and yeah, just curious to know if you think asking people to explain how they feel when they taste a certain food, if that is a something that would be a worthwhile pursuit.
I think it definitely is. I literally have taste tests in class with, I bring in different dates. I bring in, because the grocery store nearby has, 10 different varieties. So I bring them all in. I have students taste olive oil. The emmer and einkorn bread that I made, we brought that to class and cut that up. And you can also, it's not just taste, you can see the difference because the two breads are different colors. One is more of slightly orangey, one is more like a grayish color. So focusing on taste as in sensory perception, I think is a really useful way to focus and to think about the different also uses and applications. So for example, with regard to dates, students discover it all surprises me that many of my American students have not ever tried dates. I wonder how is that possible, but a lot of people haven't. So it's like opens culinary horizons, by the way, so that's really important. But then they realize when you're eating things side by side, the different textures, sweetness levels, and functions. So some of the dates, one date in particular, variety, is very popular for Ramadan and breaking the fast, and it's very prized, but it's not very sweet compared to the Deglet Noor, which is the standard date that we see most often in the United States and probably also the UK, which is very sweet and you can use it for baking purposes.
They spray them with sugar.
Really?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's why they're very sweet.
They're super sweet.
They're picked immature, so they don't actually have a lot of sugar in them. And they spray them with sugar coating.
Wow, that's really interesting. Because then when you taste some of the other dates, you realize, oh, this is actually the less sweet ones are actually it's interesting. So yeah, so I do all of that. I think it's a great way to get people thinking about what they're doing. And our learning and our collective scholarship as a cognitive experience. It focuses and sharpens the senses. And it goes back to that idea also relating to sources. I think we have to use whatever we've got. And I think we don't do that enough because we think it might not be serious, like to use the paintings as evidence, for example, and the internal details.
I think we'll probably just do a couple more questions to wrap things up. And Heather, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. So there's a question from Dimitri, and then I actually had a question for you as well. There are also a bunch of really great comments in the chat. I would love to go through all of them, but unfortunately, we're just a bit strapped for time. So Dimitri asks, does the slow food movement represent this desire or a desire to preserve food heritage, including food as craft and lifestyle?
So the slow food movement is fascinating. I applaud what they're doing, but when I look in practice at their website, at least I'm looking at Philadelphia. I don't know how much you know about them, but they tend to be more focused on, even though they're emphasizing a return to things like emmer wheat or einkorn or beans and slow food, they tend to be focused on more of this haute cuisine level and tend to be more attuned with restaurants and with what sometimes people are calling gastro diplomacy or culinary diplomacy. Are you familiar with them? So I think what they're doing is great in trying to revive an awareness and appreciation for simple ingredients, like soaking your beans from dried and cooking them, and simple food that is quality food. So I applaud what they're doing, but they're not, but it's more, again, in practice seems to be geared more towards a certain kind of restaurant scene.
Thank you. My question for you was to do with language, and I was really struck by you sort of teasing out the difference between potato in English and earth apple in Dutch, and like the different cultural resonances of that. And I completely agree. I think there's a very specific cultural resonance of like potato in terms of couch potato, and potentially relating to laziness, simplicity, all like this very particular cultural register, as opposed to earth apple. And I completely agree with like sort of the religious, almost spiritual element to that. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. What I was thinking about was sort of Claude Levi-Strauss and Roland Barthes thinking of food as a language, its own kind of language. And I was just wondering what you had to think about how you would balance food as its own language or as its own kind of semiotic register with the different ways in which we talk about food using language and like related issues of translation or cultural divides that come up there.
Oh, that's a really great question, a deep one. I think I need to think about that some more. I have a couple of thoughts though. Yeah, I'm just starting to think about this with regard to the potato and the differences between English and Dutch. And indeed, in English, it's really not respected. Couch potato, not respected as a phrase. And then maybe that's why there was an assumption in analysts of Van Gogh's paintings that he was actually criticizing what he saw there. Another example that comes to mind while I'm on the subject, because it's relevant to South Asia, I remember many years ago in a South Asian grocery store in Connecticut, talking about, the long beans, I love them. They sell them here on Cali Road. I just bought some today. Do you know, there are these really long green beans? Do you know the ones I mean? I forget what, do you know the ones? They're this long. They're in the refrigerator case. Have you not used them? Okay, so years ago, you can buy them here. They're wonderful. They're great. You can chop them very easily. But I remember in a South Asian grocery store in Connecticut, somebody saying, oh, the checkout person, oh, I would never eat those because where I come from, we feed them to horses. And so we sometimes call them horse beans. And it's like what the potato was. They were feeding them to pigs. It was animal feed. And so I think, and in the United States, somebody was telling me they live in an area that grows a lot of barley, partly for the beer industry, but also for animal feed. The student is from Nebraska. So they have vast barley fields, but it's not for human consumption. So I think there's the verbiage, the term, the word, the language of food as you described it, literally the actual words we use. Yep. And the different connotations of those. I think there are status assumptions and certain foods carrying stigmas in some contexts and not others. Certain foods having a reputation as being cheap versus expensive, or high class versus low class. And the class dynamics comes into it. The symbolic language of food, that's another part of it. Food, yeah, and then food is a way of conveying love or disdain. And were you thinking about it in other ways as well?
I mean, that definitely covers a lot of what I was thinking about in terms of the different like symbolic emotional registers. I was also thinking about food and power, which you do touch on at various different points.
Yeah.
But something I'm really interested in is meat and sort of various different cultural valences of meat, which obviously are very dependent on like cultural context, class context, gender context. And so just as like a very basic example, meat is often associated with a certain masculinized type of power in the Western world. Whereas if you take India, for example, the consumption of meat is really heavily stigmatized because, the current political climate of India is one of right-wing Hindu nationalism that prioritizes a very specific kind of like religious-based, but also political-based vegetarianism. And so to eat meat is to be marginalized in that way.
That's fascinating. I mean, there's a great literature on the class dynamics of food in the Middle East, going back to lentils, who should eat lentils or not versus meat. Early Islamic cookbooks, some of them are almost completely meat-based when people could not have been eating that much meat at all. So then, another aspect that I've become fascinated with is the question of food as aspiration, aspirational food, what we wish we were eating versus what we're actually eating. And that's a big thing on when you look at food videos or Instagram or whatever it is, YouTube, or, you know, what people, it looks like people seem to be eating versus what we're really getting. And then the gender dynamics are very, very significant too. When I was looking for pictures of guacamole, thinking about the guacamole of Super Bowl Sunday, I was really struck by how gendered it is. There are a surprising number of recipes which say that men can make guacamole. And yeah, it's not hard to make guacamole, but you know, like there's a big feature in GQ magazine, for example, on guacamole and Super Bowl Sunday. So there are all kinds of social performances of class and status, of whether you know, wealth, religion, where you're from, claims to authenticity or ownership or not. It's a fraught political field.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you so much.